This episode of Crosscut Talks is supported by Alaska Airlines.
Hey, welcome to Crosscut Talks. I'm Mark Baumgarten, the managing editor at Crosscut. And today we're talking about climate change, how it's changing the way people live, and more importantly for this discussion, where they live. This is a conversation about migration. Now, I always learn a lot from the talks that we share on this podcast, but every once in a while a guest says something that completely changes the frame for me, that shifts the way I view the world, even a little bit. That happened in this conversation with two very smart journalists. Sonia Shah is an award-winning science journalist and author. Her latest book is The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move. Abrahm Lustgarten reports on climate change for ProPublica. He's also the author of a three-part investigation for the New York Times Magazine on global human migration and climate change, and he's currently writing a book on the topic. So, this big aha moment comes early in this conversation with Crosscut Science and Environment editor Ted Alvarez, which was recorded at this year's Crosscut Festival in May. Shah walks through her own evolution of really understanding migration and comes to the conclusion that migration is maybe not so much a problem as it is a solution. Like Shah, before her awakening, I've always thought about migration as a kind of negative thing, a migrant crisis. We always see those two words together in news stories. But humans are a migratory species. We've moved for food, for opportunity, for safety from persecution, and now, more and more, humans are moving as a way to escape the more brutal impacts of climate change. Now, this isn't to deny the devastating effects of climate change. Neither of our guests are saying anything like that. But this conversation is steeped in a kind of realism, an idea that as we enter into an era of undeniable environmental transformation, we perhaps need to embrace this kind of migration. Now, maybe embracing climate migration is unrealistic in the current political environment, but it's definitely worth thinking about, because whether we embrace it or deny it, it's coming. This conversation and all other conversations on the science and environment track at the 2021 Crosscut Festival is sponsored by John S. Adams, CFP and UBS, which would like to share the following message. The Arbor Group at UBS has a straightforward mission: to help you make the world a better place. Through personal financial planning and sustainable investment management, the Arbor Group works with each of their clients to pursue that client's specific goals. Learn more by visiting ubs.com/team/The Arbor Group. And one note on this recording, due to some technical difficulties during the event, Sonia Shah disappears for a portion of this conversation, but she does make the most of her time here. Really hoping we can have her on again sometime in the future. I hope you enjoy the talk. If you have any feedback, please send it to talks@crosscut.com. Okay, on with the show.
Abrahm, Sonia, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Nice to be here.
So it's interesting to me that when we talk about human migration, especially in the context of climate change, it's this global phenomena that will drive changes that I think we can scarcely imagine, and that you guys are doing the great work of taking us through that. But I think the origin stories for both of you about why you are interested in this are intensely personal. So I was wondering if you could take us through that a little bit, and I'll start with you, Sonia.
Sure. For me, I'm the child of immigrants. My parents came over from India in the 1960s, and I think I very much internalized the idea of migration as anomalous. I always felt that my own presence in North America was somehow sort of out of place. That I, couldn't really fit in exactly in North America, but also couldn't really fit in when I went back to India to visit relatives. So there was a sense of this long distance act of migration that my parents committed that, it really kind of put me out of place somehow. And I think that contributed to really my whole career arc as a journalist, which has been looking at the disruptive effects of people, animals, microbes sort of moving in new ways. I've written a lot about infectious disease outbreaks, which is all about that, pandemics, which is all about that too. So, I started to look at migration as migration around 2015, when the so-called migrant crisis was happening in the Mediterranean, and lots of Syrian and Afghans and Africans were trying to make their way into Western Europe and getting stuck in the Mediterranean Sea and in Southern Europe. And, I went there thinking that this would be a disruptive sort of, catastrophic thing, especially for public health, which was, what I had been reporting on for years before that. And what I found was really just the opposite, that the people who were moving into these new places were actually often healthier than the host populations they joined, which is a well-documented phenomenon called the healthy migrant effect. And it actually makes sense when you think about it for even a second, because migration itself requires resilience and good health. Like, it's just really hard to do otherwise. So, it made me start thinking, well, why did I immediately kind of reflexively consider migration as a kind of a problem, a kind of a crisis? And I realized that was a very kind of conventional understanding of migration. We talk about when we see people moving around, we kind of immediately use the term migrant crisis, right? Like, we don't really first stop and think, well, is it life-saving for those people? Is there absorptive capacity where they're going? Does it contribute to the resilience of the societies they leave behind? We don't really look at that whole picture. We just kind of immediately sense, oh, something's out of place. This is a disruptive thing. Migration is happening, and it's somehow kind of a crisis or a catastrophe in some way that we can't fully articulate, but we kind of, reflexively understand as sort of negative. So I wanted to start kind of investigating where that idea comes from and how that will play a role, as we enter this era of massive climate change, where we know that our wild species, they need to move. We know that they need to move into new places in order to survive the changing climate. And a lot of them are already doing that. 80% of wild species that have been studied, these are from all different taxa, are moving into new places, usually moving north and into the heights in sync with the changing climate. And I think we can see some signals of that happening among people too. People are moving in new ways and in new places and in new ways and into new places. And I think what I wanted to try to look at in my book was whether this is something that is a crisis that we need to prevent somehow, or could this be part of the solution to the crises that we're facing with climate change?
And so, Brum, I was really struck by your essay, when the wildfires got so bad in California, or have been for several years now, it sort of brought everything home that you've been researching and reporting on to roost. I'm curious, did you have a personal motivation when you began this project, or was that when it all kind of like came back down on you?
Yeah, I mean, the personal motivation, the personal connection really came through the reporting of the project. It began with with just this curiosity about many of the issues that Sonia is talking about, and what would environment's effects be on where people choose to live. How would people begin to respond to climate change? And we often talk about climate change in terms of changing environmental conditions, or the science of it, or the temperature of it, or the amount of precipitation, but a lot less about how we live with it, or how we're going to live with it. So it started out of a curiosity with that, and a really kind of analytical approach to this idea that we could maybe quantify it, and I tried to do that through some modeling. But even behind the modeling, is this sort of reporting curiosity of, could we break down like the human decision making? Could we try to figure out how does environment actually inform? When does an individual person decide to move, to pick up and change their lives? And so that's where this sort of personal part came in. It was a several part project for me, and the first was really globally focused. But in the midst of that, of course, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we've been dealing with wildfires, and sometimes that's been an immediate threat, and sometimes it's been a more distant threat where we just sort of suffer from bad air quality and smoke. But it happened over 2 seasons over the course of my reporting, and so the first, was sort of this light bulb had gone off, and I was about 6 months into reporting, and I'm like, oh, my discomfort is a form unequal to many other people's experience around the world, but is a form of environment influencing my thinking about where I live. And, in my own context of privilege and ability and living in the United States and all of that, it was still sort of, provoking the same questioning that was exactly what I was asking villagers about in Guatemala, which is like, what's your threshold? How do you experience the environment around you? When would you decide to make a change, or how much can you live with? And do you like it? Do you not like it? And that became, for us in California, for me, it just became an ever more sort of pressing question as my project was delayed through COVID, and I found myself in January of 2020 now publishing the second, or September, I think, publishing the second part of my series, which was focused on American migration, and I was right in the thick of it, just kind of living that question at that point. So yeah, it became very personal, and in a way that helped me understand the reporting better, but not in a way that drove that reporting, or was the reason why I chose this project.
Yeah. Another thing that I think you both do really well is you take, in both your series and the book, is you take all of this data and all of the science and sort of trace all of how it's moving across landscapes and countries and beyond borders. But then to really make those stories land, you have very personal stories, these very personal narratives, encounters and interactions with real people on the ground who are experiencing this migration right now. I'm wondering if one particular story, for those who are maybe less familiar with the book and the series, leaps to mind where you met somebody on the ground who maybe challenged or changed your perception of migration. And I'll start with you, Sonia.
I mean, almost everyone I met sort of, the stories that you hear are so complex and so sort of peculiar and particular that they're all really very powerful and give you a lot of insights, just each one in different ways. But I remember going to, when I was in Greece, speaking to the people who were detained there, Syrians and Afghans mostly, and I was just really struck by how many of them were teachers and journalists and lawyers, and these were like professional class people who had picked up and left, and they were living in tents in parking lots for months and years at a time. That struck me because it was kind of different than the stereotype of the dusty refugee in the camp, which I think is sort of, we have this, the depiction is more commonly of somebody who's kind of really down and out and desperate. And of course, these are people who have a lot of resources actually, who are able to make these incredible journeys. But I remember talking to a Haitian man who had made it to Canada, and his journey had started in Haiti, then he went to Brazil, then he went to Venezuela, and then he went mostly on foot through, I think it was 9 countries to get up to Panama. And when you get to Panama, the road kind of ends through the Darien Gap, which is this, very thick jungle at the end of Panama. He walked through that. I think it took about a week, and he went with maybe a dozen people, of whom only a few survived. And then he got to the other side and then made it all the way to the US-Mexico border, somehow got into the United States. And then the Trump administration changed their rules about who from Haiti could actually come into the United States and be granted different kinds of protection. So he went up to Canada, and he was a refugee from the United States as well, and made it up to Canada. And then he was kind of waiting for his status in Montreal. And he was living in this chilly flat, wearing his flip-flops and t-shirt. It was freezing cold in Montreal, and he was with a whole bunch of other Haitian guys who had made a similar journey. I mean, just amazing amounts of resilience and innovation to make it through all that. And then, for me as an American, to hear that these people, who had made it to the United States, which was I mean, I grew up with that idea of, bring us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses and all that. And then had to flee the United States to find refuge somewhere else. That really has stuck with me.
How about you, Abrahm?
Yeah, just thinking through my encounters as Sonia was speaking, and I think the strongest impressions are the same ones that I wrote about. Sort of getting at my analytical quest. I went down to Central America reporting, and I think I had this, idea that I'd be sort of tapping into people's decision-making process. And together, we'd sort of sit down and work out a list of pros and cons to staying put or migrating to the United States or migrating somewhere else, and I didn't know what would be in those columns, but that's what I was kind of there to find out. And my takeaway and what really drove the stories was realizing that, by the time, at least for the people that I was, working with, by the time they got to the point of really considering migration out of their sort of rural and sustenance farming kind of existence, there were no columns of pros and cons. There was just sheer necessity. That really moving migration for many of these people was an absolute last resort. And I think that's what you see in the research, and it's true that migration has driven exchange of cultures on our planet forever. But it's also true that people have an amazing gravitation towards their sense of home, and community, and and so when it comes to the kind of disruptive environmental conditions I was looking at and what was driving the people in the communities, it was they had gotten to a point where they had really pulled out all the stops, borrowed all the money, tried all of the local jobs, tried migrating to the cities, and then come back home and failed and all of that, and then couldn't eat, and just really suffering like acute malnutrition and hunger. And we're this region, this part of Highlands, Guatemala, was at the time really on the edge of famine, and that by the time father and son in a household that I spent time with actually hired a coyote, a guide, to bring them to the United States, who decided to make that journey. It was a painful one and not one that anybody wanted to make, and it was just driven from sheer desperation. And that was really the eye-opening discovery for me of this entire body of reporting.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it contrasts with something else that you brought up in your reporting that was fascinating, which is that, as opposed to many parts of the world, as you were describing, Americans tend to move perhaps against our best interests toward heat, coastlines, things like that. Why is that? And do you see that changing as these sort of climate emergencies become more frequent and more intense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the first answer to get out of the way is, I think, culturally, Americans kind of think that we think of ourselves as a bit impervious to circumstances, and we can overpower, nature, we can out-engineer it, or we're just kind of invincible. But that's kind of a subjective judgment. But there's a bunch of structural parts of our system that have encouraged the U.S. population to move into places that happen to be the highest risk. And, so insurance, the way that insurance is structured and offered is one of those, and the way that the United States in various ways subsidizes both housing and also disaster relief are other ways that have pushed population growth in places like Florida, where, there is state subsidization of insurance, so that you can, even though we know there's increasing number of hurricanes and we've seen many billions of dollars in damages, you can still buy insurance on the coastline in Florida pretty affordably, and that's because the state subsidizes and has for more than a decade subsidized that, and that's one of many forms of pulling populations into what are, at least from an environmental standpoint or a climate change standpoint, kind of the wrong places. You look at the population of the Southwest, or the growth of Phoenix, Arizona, or the over-reliance on the Colorado River, which is built out with federal infrastructure and federal subsidies. These are all things that have pulled us kind of into relatively high stress environmental environments. So a couple things are changing now. The apparent impact of the climate is becoming very obvious, and we've had a couple devastating 4 or 5 years in a row across the country, whether it's wildfires or hurricanes or floods in Houston or deep freezes in Texas, that are awakening, I think, people across the spectrum politically, to the real change that is afoot. And at the same time, and partially in response to that, the financial mechanisms are changing as well. So those subsidies are disappearing, whether it's states, rejiggering their policies to be, a little bit more sustainable, or banks or finance systems and credit rating agencies starting to evaluate climate risk in a different way. So the incentives that have pulled Americans in the wrong direction are disappearing, while their vision of the risk that they face is becoming, more explicit every day. And I do think, there's some, I don't know where that tipping point is, but there is a point where, that will push those who don't want to live in that high risk environment to move to a place that they think is lower risk.
Kind of connected to that, some countries are seizing on the opportunity of migration, or how they can kind of rethink their infrastructure faster than others. Like you see Russia, for instance, embracing this potential of becoming the world's breadbasket, as the climate shifts. Are we seeing any similar things happening here in the United States, or opportunities for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have not seen that as explicitly as you think. You might think that that we would, and maybe it's to come. But I think so just described all the ways in which we seem to be coming to terms with climate change, but we're still so far behind and have been so slow, to come to terms with that. I think in the commercial sector there is a push to get ahead of the curve in terms of seeing the opportunities of climate change. And there's, this kind of climate intelligence arms race around the science to see, who can understand what's coming best and model it best. And if they can deploy that, commercially for profit before somebody else does. But in terms of larger, societal, or policy changes, the way you described, what I wrote about Russia, and that's this idea that, Russia's trying to build out its agriculture industry because its lands are changing and it can grow more food, and, that there is a long-term strategy to perhaps, strengthen themselves. I haven't come across that same kind of dynamic in a big way in the United States. You see elements of communities planning for it, which is interesting. Like the state of Vermont has a sustainability plan that anticipates really significant population growth there, because they think a lot of people will move north and want that kind of environment, or will need it. And I think that's probably, true. And you see those conversations starting in other places around, the Great Lakes region, or whether it's Wisconsin or Minnesota, Rochester, New York. But that's to say they're starting to think about what the change will bring and perhaps how they need to adapt to it. But I haven't really come across a great example of anybody trying to get ahead of that and figure out how to especially thrive in that environment yet.
Yeah,
probably coming soon.
Yeah, hopefully. This is a question that I think both of you would have a lot of insight into. But I mean, even today there was reporting on the how birth rates in the U.S. are falling. We're just having, and all the reasons why we are on this trajectory to have, we're not having as much population growth as we have in the past. And so is it possible for this migration? I think other writers like Matthew Iglesias maybe has made an argument for 1 billion Americans and how we might embrace that kind of migration. Is that something that you see as a potential? Maybe we embrace some of this influx of population that can then, offset other things, like to paying for the social safety net, say, that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I see that happening anytime soon. Obviously, I mean, we face a real kind of political and cultural crossroads and backlash, at the moment that makes that difficult. Long term, maybe. I haven't tracked the 1 billion, conversation, but what I have seen and wrote about in part, is economic analysis that suggests that northern countries, will see greater economic growth as the climate changes, and so long as they have the manpower or the person power, to support that growth. And it so happens that a lot of northern countries, the United States included, but even more so, Canada or Scandinavian countries or Russia, are in a pretty steep demographic decline. They're aging, faster than new nationals are being born. and the U.S. has started to head in that direction, as well. So it suggests, but no one's really sure about this yet, that if you're going to really seize that economic growth that might be available through the changing climate, that you'll need a lot more people to do it. And I'll come back to the U.S. in a second, but Canada, Russia has great opportunity to expand this way should they choose to take in migrants, and migrants choose to go there. Canada is a destination for migrants and has recognized its need for a larger population, and has this informal program pushing to grow that population from about 38 million to 100 million Canadians over the next century, called the Century Initiative. And so there is that explicit recognition. But the United States, I just think we're really having a difficult time culturally wrapping our heads around, mixing as a society and bringing more people across the border, and having sympathies for those impacted by climate change, as well as all the other things that force migration and lead to it. And I think there's plenty of evidence that our economy would benefit from some amount. I don't know what the number is, some amount of added grown workforce, but I just don't see us quite as ready to embrace that as other parts of the world are at the moment.
Do you think like the pandemic has changed our thinking, and maybe prepared us to make some of these changes culturally a little bit? I mean, obviously we're seeing all kinds of cultural grinding there. And I think at the beginning there was a lot of noise about the cities are going to hollow out, and people will, with remote work, will move, to smaller and more rural areas. And maybe that hasn't quite happened with home prices and the like. So, but yeah, I'm just curious if you think the pandemic has altered our thinking.
Yeah, I've come kind of full circle personally on trying to wrap my head around how the pandemic has changed things, and it's sort of like it's changed everything and it's changed nothing at the same time. It's you mentioned the exodus from cities, which is a short-term phenomenon. A lot of the researchers that I talk to think that in the long run that will reverse for two reasons. One, that we've been urbanizing as a society for a really long time, and the bigger, broader trend and momentum is in that direction. But also that, as with respect to climate change in particular, the expenses required, and the investment in the infrastructure and the policy and the sort of the robust governance that's going to be needed to adapt to a lot of the change that's coming is going to be something that cities can afford to do more than rural areas. And the more they do, the more that they will attract people, and people will need to live in a place that has, those systems to support them. And so there's sort of, a vision for a long-term urbanization, as one of the sort of movement phenomenons. And then COVID, of course, it's taught us that the most unforeseeable and unthinkable can be right around the corner, and and it can change moment by moment. What you learn on Tuesday versus Friday versus Sunday, and it's sort of so everything's up in the air. On one hand, it's shown us how interconnected the world is, because I think that's how these coronaviruses got to the United States in the first place, and we just have a larger population that's traveling more, whether it's from the jungles of South Asia to the cities of China, or from the cities of China to Europe and the United States, and so forth. But it's also hardened our sense of, our sort of nationalistic impulses, I think, which is another, risk of migration in general. But, the COVID years taught us to close borders and be self-protective. And those are things that, are maybe coincidentally, but which also happen in response to large-scale migration, and what you see in response to the pressures on the U.S. border right now. And so I don't know, if the lesson that we see from COVID, 5 years from now or longer, is that we're all connected and we need to allow greater cross-border movement, or that we're also connected, we need to disconnect more and protect ourselves and kind of shut things down.
Mm. I'm also curious, like outside of, these big sort of whatever powers of or whatever levers government has to pull to kind of counteract these changes and these mass migrations. I'm wondering if you see any grassroots activities on the ground, like communities that are coming together and finding ways to mitigate or migrate or adjust, outside of governmental support.
Yeah, to a limited degree, and what I'm thinking as you ask that question is, a lot of the political movement that's happening, in the South, in the southeastern United States, and especially around, push for climate equity, and to kind of reverse some of the structural biases. Environmental justice has been, an enormous concern in terms of pollution, and other environmental factors in terms of disproportionately affecting Black and brown people around the country, and particularly in the South. And climate will be an extension of that for a lot of reasons, ranging from the availability of insurance or affordability of insurance to the way cities zone their neighborhoods. So there is a bit of a grassroots movement that I see across the South to think up a sort of a version of the Green New Deal. I mean, what kind of growth is sustainable? What kind of adaptation to climate change or rising sea levels on the Louisiana coast, for example, does enhance adaptation, but protects against rapid gentrification and things like that. So I'm seeing that in some of those communities, and then on the flip side, I guess I'm hearing a little bit from places like Rochester, New York, where the city has taken a large number of Puerto Rican migrants. People have moved from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. That there is that they're maybe a little bit ahead in that process of other U.S. cities in terms of thinking about how to provide that infrastructure and embrace that that growth and the economic opportunity that comes with that. So those are two places where I think there is some forward movement and some creative energy being put towards this problem or challenge.
Now that we have you back, Sonia, I want to return. We're basically talking about with all of the risks and the doom and gloom that comes with migration. One thing that I think your book pursues in a really direct and interesting way is the opportunities. And so I was hoping you could take us through from your perspective, what are the opportunities of this migration, especially if we can kind of reorient how we think about it and get past maybe some of the nationalist tendencies that are coming up in the wake of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, the comparison to wildlife is really interesting, because in conservation circles and in wildlife biology, the notion that wild species are moving into new places in sync with the changing climate is embraced as a wonderful thing, because that means that we have a chance of preserving biodiversity in the future as the climate changes. So in conservation circles, the conversation is about how do we facilitate these movements so that creatures that can no longer live in the place where they're stuck are not stuck in those places, and it can actually move into new places if they're able to do that. Can we create corridors? Can we connect parks? Can we build bridges over highways so panthers can walk over them, things like that, which is really exciting. And I think when we're looking at human migration, I think one way we could start to think about it is, well, what is the option, right? So if we're not allowing people to move into new places where they can find, habitable spaces to live in, then do we want them to be trapped where they are as the seas rise and as their fields dry out? Because what happens when you trap people in places is not that they just kind of go away and adapt to those places. They'll still try to move. It'll just all happen at once and in a catastrophic way. And so that's what I saw when I was in Bahamas, last year after Hurricane Dorian, which is, islands where the average altitude is 3 feet above sea level, and they're having these massive storms, these big, slow-moving storms that can be incredibly destructive because of climate change and warmer waters. And people haven't been able to move from those places if they, there's a whole minority of people there, the Haitian minority in particular, who have been really marginalized, and they're not able to move easily. They don't have a lot of legal pathways to move. And so even those people who would have liked to have moved earlier before the hurricanes started, before the hurricane seasons. There's many people. There's lots of sort of pent up demand, so to speak, for people who are willing to move earlier, and who really, if they had been allowed to move, you can imagine that would have contributed to the resilience of the people who are left behind, because there would have been more space. The little bit of higher ground that is there, could have been more fruitfully occupied, instead of having all these people who really had nowhere to go when the storm hit, and what happens when they're trapped is now, many of them died, of course. And those who survived, they're still trapped there, except now they're living in an even more exposed state, because before, at least, they had sort of cement walls around them, and now they have really makeshift sort of shanties and shacks that they're living in. People are living in overturned buses and things like that. So they're even more exposed. So we're really creating a crisis by not kind of opening those release valves so people can move in advance of the really catastrophic climate events that happen. So I think if we find it cumbersome and troubling to have lots of people coming in unregulated flows and up to the US border and knocking on the door, and then we have to sort of deal with that, and that seems really burdensome to us. I mean, on one hand, it seems to me that it's well within our capacities to manage these flows if we were willing to just spend the resources and get some more immigration judges and get more asylum officers and people who can actually process these claims in a reasonable fashion. That doesn't seem beyond the capacities of the US government. But if we don't want to do that, and we think it is troubling that people just come and knock on our door and then, and process them, well, we need to just open up more legal pathways. We know that works. And there's a lot of people, I think, who would take us up on those. I mean, you look at the number of people who are enrolled in the UNHCR's refugee program. These are people who don't even leave the places where they're stuck. They're waiting for permission to come. And there's millions and millions of them. So I think 39 million or something. Abrahm probably knows the number offhand. So something like that the UNHCR has already decided, well, these people qualify as refugees. Well, here in the United States, we're letting in 65,000 of those people next year. And even that is being sort of embraced as some huge benefit, just the huge act of generosity. Well, it's just a tiny drop in the bucket of what we need. And if we think about, do we really want to live in a world where when we ourselves will have these crises, and when we ourselves will have to knock on someone else's door and say, look, my state is on fire now, or my city is underwater? Do we really want to set a precedent where the answer is, well, we're pulling up the ladders and closing the doors on you and all of your kind? I don't think so. I think what we want to do is sort of create a system where we all can increase our resilience to the crisis that we're really all sharing. The way the planet is settled was based on 19th century shipping. It's not logical. If we had to resettle the planet right now, we would not put all of our major cities on rivers and on coastlines. We would do it differently. But that's in fact where people live. And what we know about human migration is people start in the countryside, they move to the nearest city, then they jump to the next city across a international border, and then they cross an ocean, and it's this stepwise fashion. And we can use that to our advantage if we embrace migration as something that can contribute to our resilience, instead of pretending it's this problem we can somehow end.
We'll be back with more after this message.
Ready to take your travels to the next level? Alaska Airlines is committed to providing a higher standard of safety and cleanliness throughout your journey. From mask requirements and touch-free options to HEPA filters on board and everything in between. Plus, their award-winning loyalty program, Mileage Plan, makes it easy to earn and redeem miles wherever you go, including destinations worldwide, thanks to their One World Alliance membership. If you're ready to land a low fare, next-level care, and the best experience in the air, book now at alaskaair.com.
Okay, well, I want to make sure we have some time for some audience questions that we have rolling in. So I'm going to go to those. Human societies tend to be tribal and view people in other countries as others or invaders. Won't systemic resocialization be needed to create the welcoming environments that climate change immigration will require?
Can I take a stab at that?
Yes, please.
That is a common conception, but what I found when you look into the social science research, that in fact, when different peoples collide in new places, conflict is actually the exception. It's not the rule. In most places where you have people from different places coming together, they assimilate really quickly. And there's been lots of social science research around that. So xenophobia is actually an exceptional response to different peoples coming together. And so it's worth really examining why we have the xenophobic responses in some situations and not others. And also embracing the fact that, well, most of the time assimilation actually does work. You know, there's been people moving around for a long time. What we know from paleogenetics is we've been moving around from the very beginning. When we walked out of Africa, we didn't just stay put in Europe and North America and Asia. We kept moving around, even in ancient times, even in prehistoric times. People were colliding and mixing in all kinds of complicated ways, and we can see that in our DNA, right? We can see all the little bits and pieces of DNA that we've picked up from all of our travels that our ancestors have done. And that all worked because we were able to mix with each other, and we, to such an extent that we reproduced together and had families together. And that's why all of our genes are so mixed up. We don't have really well-defined genetic populations in Homo sapiens, like other species do have that. But humans really, we mix and match pretty well.
That's great. Here's a specific one that might touch on some of Abraham's reporting, but I'm sure you both have ideas about it. In Louisiana, whole communities have already gone underwater. For a few, there's been a planned migration, essentially to move the whole community inland by a certain distance. When I think about New Orleans, though, or Miami or NYC, this seems super impractical. How could we do this, and how would we ever rebuild the cultural soul those cities embody?
I wish there was a great, easy answer to this question. And this is what makes the task ahead of us so difficult. One answer, not to be glib about it, but it's those communities that can afford to resist and build, physical infrastructure barriers to protect them against that change will do so. And so one of the reasons why you see, levees in New Orleans and may eventually see, an expensive seawall around New York City is because those economies are more robust and the people there are wealthier than the indigenous communities, on the south coast of Louisiana, who have no resources and where the cost of building that physical infrastructure would just be so astronomical as to cripple, even communities that tried to pay for it, because you get into this, vicious cycle of the expense and the cost of the bond measures, and the taxes go up, and so people leave the school districts, which collapse, and you get this spiral into a community collapse, unfortunately. And so, it's one of the reasons why what I mentioned earlier, is that I think that we'll see sort of gravitation towards cities, because the cities will be wealthier, and whether they're New Orleans or New York City, that's where you'll see a bit of that kind of consolidation.
If I can be selfish for our Pacific Northwest audience and ask, from your perspective, I would say from the domestic perspective would be Abrahm, and then the global perspective would be Sonia. How might the Pacific Northwest change? What are the biggest changes that we should be ready to weather from migration over the near long term?
I mean, I can jump in with what I see, for the Pacific Northwest. It probably won't come as a great surprise. On the downside, you'll see rising temperatures and more common wildfires and more common smoke, which may be outweighed by, the benefits, which is that it'll remain a pretty, wet and temperate place. And as water becomes more scarce, you'll have the water resources, much of the Pacific Northwest will, to cope with that. When I looked at agriculture across, some of the inland Pacific Northwest into Idaho and so forth, the forecast is for crop yields to increase substantially in a lot of places. So as you see, it becoming more and more difficult to grow whatever crop, whether it's corn or grapes, from California to Nebraska, you're going to see that farming opportunity increase and maybe, productivity along with it increase, even on the kind of, eastern slopes of the Pacific Northwest. and obviously you'll have sea level rise to contend with. And the research is already showing that that Seattle, especially, but Portland too, and Vancouver, our destinations have been receiving a large number of moving people for years already. Many Americans, but not only Americans. And so, some of the models that people have actually completed that I've looked at suggest that that'll increase, and it'll be a destination region in the future.
Sonia, do you have any prognostications for how the future of the Northwest might play?
Oh no, I think Abrahm really covered it. In every place there's this very fine-grained, these differences are very fine-grained, and we have to look at like the details and how they affect the kind of culture that people have created in those different places. So I think about some places are going to be more resilient to that kind of change than other places. I mean, think about places like Florida and being connected to the palm tree, and what happens when the palm trees don't grow in Florida anymore, or what happens in Minnesota when the moose are all gone and they're somewhere else, and how much of the local culture is based on the flora and fauna that are shaped by the climate. I mean, just like we are, right? But like our cultures are so influenced by the ecosystems around us.
Yeah, this might be a good time to wrap up. So we're actually about at the amount of time that we have. So Abrahm, Sonia, thank you so much for the great conversation.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Sonia, Abrahm, and Ted for the talk. And thanks also to the folks in the audience who asked questions. If you'd like to be one of those audience members for a future Crosscut event, go to crosscut.com/events. This episode of Crosscut Talks was engineered by Chi Lee. The live recording was engineered by Resty Bacall and Victoria Ralph, and the event was produced by Jake Newman and Andrea O'Meara. Ann Krisnovich and Mo Cloud managed our audience engagement. If you'd like to subscribe to Crosscut Talks, you can do just that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. And if you would like to support the work that we do at Crosscut, whether it's the live events we host every month or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/donate. Crosscut Talks is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Mark Baumgarten. We'll be back soon with another conversation.